Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Taurus Moon, as the luminary out of Sect, I speak with the astrologer Steph Koyfman. We talked about the placement of her moon in the 8th whole sign house, but also talked a lot about other placements in her natal chart, as well as important parts of her astrological practice. We discussed the potential tendencies of exalted planets, what a stationary Venus can mean in a chart, and how she can manifest as a morning star. We discussed the centrality of the Progressed Lunar Phase to Steph's practice, as well as how the moon can express herself in different phases. And we discussed the potential of 8th house placements to receive support from others. Now for my conversation with Steph. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to her website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. All right, Steph Koyfman, thank you so much for being here with me today. It's a pleasure to have you. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. Mercury's my perfected Time Lord, and it's definitely the retrograde is definitely doing its thing, but hanging in there, trying to roll with the punches, trying to embody that mercurial, flexible nature. It's a little tough, but yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, can you offer for us just a brief personal introduction to yourself and your astrological practice?
Yeah, so I'm an astrologer and a writer. I've been a writer longer than I've been an astrologer, and I guess a good way to sort of sum up who I am is that I've always been sort of living through my ninth house in some way, shape, or form.
Mm,
Um, I guess when I was growing up, I'm a first generation American, so like a lot of my upbringing was sort of influenced by having an immigrant family and being raised on like Russian folk tales and things like that.
mm,
Um, I went to school for journalism and I was a journalist for quite some time. I got into astrology, so I was kind of doing that at the same time. And most recently, I was working for a language learning app. So I'm always kind of there, always kind of hanging out in that space.
yeah. And if I don't want to reveal the name of the language learning app, but
Mm.
it's international, correct?
It's Babel. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
fine.
Okay. So it has that kind of like ninth house foreign lands
Hmm.
kind of connotation. And just for people to know, if it's okay, you have Gemini in the ninth house,
Yes.
Mercury and Venus there.
Yeah.
Happy soon to be Venus return to you.
It was yesterday,
Oh,
actually, my
awesome.
exact. Yeah. Maybe this
Cool.
podcast is my Venus return.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't realize she was that like late, like that far into Gemini already.
Hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and your journalism was what was like your beat, quote unquote, or what did you cover?
Well, I guess in true Gemini fashion, I didn't really have a beat. I was kind of scattered all over the place.
Awesome.
I don't think that niche, I don't think a niche ever really happened for me. I don't think that part ever cohered.
Mm. Is there anything that you wanted to tell us about your astrological practice, as well as like some of the influences that you've had, teachers that you've had, etc.?
Yeah, so I kind of got put on the astrology path around the time of my first nodal return, so I was pretty young.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I got into it much the same way that a lot of people do. I read something that resonated in a way that felt beyond a little bit just coincidental, and I did a lot of self-teaching, a lot of just sort of, Googling my chart, looking on Cafe Astrology when I was in college. There was like a point where I discovered Rick Levine's horoscopes and I read them religiously. So I do consider Rick Levine one of my formative influences.
Awesome.
Um, and eventually I did go on to study formally under a teacher, under Annabelle Gatt. And it was around the time that I was studying with her that I started developing the Daily Hunch email subscription. So before I
Mm.
was Lady Kazemi, I was the Daily Hunch. And I didn't think that I was going to be an astrologer with a capital A. I thought that I was just going to launch a little email horoscope transit report service and sort of do my journalism and, not have to, be public about it. But lo and behold, here I am.
Mm.
um, And yeah, I guess there was a point where I did sort of get more into the Hellenistic traditional astrology, and Chris Brennan obviously played a big role in introducing me to a lot of that stuff. So I guess those would be my most formative influences, I would say.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, and before we kind of get into the conversation more specifically about the moon, I just wanted to let listeners know, because I like to give a little bit of context about like how I know the guests that are on the show, just
Hmm.
because I think that shapes conversations. We actually don't know each other super well, but we met at a very important time in my life in terms of my astrological learning and practice, which was NORWAC 2022.
Yep.
And yeah, that was like my kind of real beginning of seriously studying astrology. Kind of came back from that with like a real fire in me to learn, and I started this podcast in November of 22 as like a way to kind of help accelerate my learning and also document it a little bit. And Pau actually, who does the Fixed Astrology podcast, I was looking for Taurus Moon, and it didn't work out with her, but she suggested that I speak to you, and I was like, oh yeah, I
Mm,
met I met Steph
yeah.
like at the very beginning for me. So just
Yeah.
wanted to say I appreciate you being on here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tao and I actually have our moons exactly conjunct.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Yeah, so while our time in New York City overlapped for about a year, and we, would have days where we went to the bathhouse together and have a spa day for our
Mm.
Taurus moons. And actually, now that I think about it, when I met you at Norwalk, we were all hungry and trying to find a place to eat dinner. And then like a bunch of us found a massage place in the mall, and we're like, yeah.
Oh my
So
gosh. Yeah, I'm
that's
remembering that
you
now.
saw my moon on display.
Yeah, that's so funny because in the conversation, the first episode I had with Aaron Tech Shipley, we both have Sag moons, and we were talking about like walking around the mall together, having like super intense emotional conversations
Oh
while
yeah.
we were like trying to get food, and then some
Uh-huh.
people were getting massages. It was really funny.
Yeah, I made a beeline to the massage chair.
Yeah, and we were
Yeah.
like, waxing philosophical and like emotional with each other. It feels very
Yeah.
apropos.
Yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so yeah, I like to ask this question to all my guests to just get a sense of like your relationship to some of these astrological things, like before you were the astrologer that you are now.
Hmm.
So can you share a little bit about like thinking back to your childhood and a formative experience you had with the moon when you were a child, or what your relationship was with the moon then?
Well, I was a wolf kid. I really was obsessed with wolves for a long time, and I guess part of
Mm,
that was that I liked to sometimes howl at the moon.
nice.
One of my favorite childhood memories was my parents took me to a wolf preserve where they had like four different packs, all kind of, in sort of kind of converging in one sort of central area. And I stood in the middle of it and I howled and I got them all to howl in unison.
Wow.
And
That's so cool.
I don't know if they were just saying this to me because I was like 10 at the time, but they were like, no one's ever done that before. um, I do have like a couple childhood anecdotes that make me think, this is very typical Taurus moon. So I was actually born 2 weeks late. My due
Mm,
date probably would have had me, as a Scorpio moon, but I hung out in the womb long enough for them to start, kind of panicking and considering a C-section. But then I just came out in the nick of time, right when the moon was at 0 degrees of Taurus.
mm.
So I think the most Taurus moon thing about me is that I refused to be born until the moon entered Taurus.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does feel
Um,
very Taurus moon.
I was like, I'm not coming out for this shit.
You're like, I'm gonna come when I'm ready. Thank you very much.
Exactly. And then the other thing, I associate Taurus moon with lilacs for me as like a sort of a childhood memory.
Mm,
So I had a lilac bush beneath my bedroom window growing up as a kid. And, to me, that's such like I associate lilacs with Taurus season because that's usually when they're blooming.
mm.
And so to me, it's just like one of those comfort smells, those things that I like to return to. And as an adult, even if I'm in like Boston or New York City or wherever I happen to be, I usually make it my mission to find a little lilac branch and bring it home with me, or they've started selling them in the flower shop, so that's always an annual tradition for me.
Mm.
And so the first time I ever traveled to Russia, it was like, oh my God, they just have these everywhere lining the streets.
Wow.
So I guess that was sort of like a bit of like a emotional, familial, ancestral tether, that
Mm.
scent.
So it felt a little bit like coming home to a place that you hadn't been before, or had you been to
No,
Russia?
I've only been one time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. And it feels like also very apropos to have like comfort things. Like I know
Yeah.
like a lot of different like moon people probably have comfort things because the moon is so
Yeah.
associated with nourishment, but
Yeah.
feels particularly Taurus moon.
Yeah, I guess a Taurus moon would be comforted by more stereotypically comfortable things.
Mm.
Maybe a Scorpio moon would feel comforted by horror movies,
Mm, yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas for Taurus moon, it's like nice sense. Very, do you have like a
Yes.
comfort? Do you have like other comfort things that come to mind for you?
Mm, I mean, yeah, I definitely will spend more on like nice dish soap, nice hand soap.
Mm.
Yeah, like, the gain, the whatever, like the dial, get that out of here.
Hmm.
Um, Other comfort things. I like to have scented candles around.
Mm.
Um, I'm trying to like kind of go beyond the sort of obvious things.
Yeah. But it does seem like scent plays a strong role.
Yeah. I'm also kind of I've always been sort of attached to my stuff. I guess that's sort of a typical thing as well. Like recently I downsized. I got rid of almost like 85 to 90% of my belongings, and that's very unusual for me. I guess that's South Node going through my second house.
Mm.
Um, but before that, like I spent 6 years living in Boston before I moved to New York, and so I never really had to make like a big move, and so I was always able to sort of hold on to my furniture, and that furniture always had sentimental value to me, and I was like, I can't imagine ever not having this dresser.
Mm. So now that you have moved again recently, you got rid of all that furniture and you have to kind of
Hmm.
rethink what possessions mean to you almost.
Kind of, or maybe I just got to a point where I felt okay letting all of it go because,
Awesome. Yeah.
I'm in the most balsamic phase of my progressed balsamic moon,
Mm.
sort of in, sort of right at the, precipice of total death process, a rebirth.
Mm.
And I just feel like I don't need to hold on to all that stuff.
Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about the balsamic moon a little
Mm,
later. That's a like a moon phase that we share. Mine's like has waned even a little bit more, but
yeah,
yeah, I would love to talk about that when we get to lunar phase.
yeah.
But before we do that, I'd love to hear what the moon means to you today and why you think it's important to focus on the moon when we talk about astrology.
Yeah, well, I guess my most direct experience with like the moon and its field was when I did some lunar theurgy, so I do practice planetary devotion. And the moon is probably one of the planets that I've worked with the least, but the one time I did, I think it was because I was moving and I really wanted to find, a comfortable, secure home. And a lot of the results of kind of tapping into that sphere were like unexpected, because as soon as I started doing planetary devotion to the moon, I started having all these really weird psychic downloads, and just
Mm.
very strange prophetic dreams that didn't really seem to have any sort of meaning or purpose. It was just very strange synchronistic things started happening. Like I remember, like it was so random. I had this dream that I was like performing, like have you ever seen the show The Magicians?
No, I haven't.
Well, they do these like spells using their hands. Like they make
Hmm.
these hand configurations. And in the dream, I was, producing fire from my palm and counting in
Mm.
German for some reason. And
Wow.
I just thought that was kind of strange. And then the next day, I was like browsing the internet, and somehow I came upon this YouTuber, this like Israeli YouTuber who had he I feel like I forget exactly what happened, but he produced fire from his hand, and I
Mm.
was just like, what the, like, why?
Major
Ha, ha-
sync.
right, exactly. So weird stuff like that started happening when I was working with the moon.
Mm,
So that's, I guess, like, that's sort of from direct experience.
mm-hmm,
And then I guess I would say the moon is important because it is the fastest moving thing, and it's also it's constantly translating light. If you practice horary astrology, then you're probably
mm-hmm,
familiar with the concept of translation of light. And so what it does is it picks up what the other planets are putting it down, and then it brings it down into the somatic field. And so I
mm-hmm,
think that's why, we can say, as Caitlin Kopic says, that the moon is a potentiator. And so
mm,
I think that's part of why lunar aspects tend to potentiate things that are going on because of the connection to the body and the somatic field.
mm,
And then, of course, electional astrology is something I engage with frequently. A lot of times, even if I'm not doing a formal election for something, I'll always kind of check to see, like, oh, what is the moon doing? If you're making an election, then, one of the most important considerations is the condition of the moon, like
yeah.
what sign it's in, what the next aspect it's making is. You always want to make sure that the moon's happy. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm reminded of you on the astrology podcast, the Cancer episode that you were
Mm,
on, telling the story about the moon theurgy that you were doing and all the dreams that came about. And I just wanted to comment that I really resonate with that, and I wonder if it's because we're both kind of lunar people. Like my relationship with doing like theurgy, I guess I'll say with the moon is that I've done it very sporadically, which feels kind of right for the moon, but
yeah.
it's been very powerful every time I've done it. But I also have the moon in the first in mutual reception with Jupiter in the eighth in Cancer.
Mm,
And you have your sun in Cancer, which is your sect light,
yeah.
um, and like on your midheaven. And so it's like we both have these like strong Cancerian elements to us. And so I wonder if that's part of why like the moon magic, for for lack of a better term, like can be so powerful. I'm curious, like if with people with different configurations, if they've had similar experiences with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to know. I don't know if I've had that many conversations with people about moon magic.
Mm,
That kind of moon magic. There's also, obviously timing spells with like waning moon and waxing moon.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting on this podcast, like we talk a lot about people's personal experience with the moon, but I feel like maybe I've shied away a little bit from asking people about like explicit magical practices because it feels so personal.
mm,
But yeah, that's something I definitely want to learn more about for sure, people's experience with that. Yeah, and the other thing I'll say, as a horary practitioner, like the moon, yeah, just want to affirm that the moon is like super, super important in horary and electional, and that I will even sometimes, like if someone asks me a horary question, I will wait until I know that the moon is definitely not in a bad condition to look at their question and pull a chart, just because I want to like give them a shot. Um, which is maybe a little bit like I'm forcing the hand of the chart a little bit, but I do think that like when I'm doing a lot of horaries at a particular time, like I know basically exactly what's happening with the chart, where the moon is, where all the planets are. And so, it's like a good conditioned moon, it's not sufficient to bring about a positive or affirmative answer to a question, but it's definitely necessary.
hmm
Similarly with electional, where it's like if you have a well placed moon, that might not be all you need to have like a good election, but it's kind of something you do need to make it happen.
To have a fighting chance.
Right. Exactly. And so yeah, I like to give people a fighting chance for sure.
How do you usually work with void wounds in horary? Like, because I know different people have different ideas about what that means. Like some people will just throw out the whole chart and some people will just kind of see it as like a cautionary note.
Yeah, I mean, I try to just wait. I follow the void moon definition, which like I've come to call medieval. I think it goes back further than that, but it doesn't have to do with sign boundaries. It has to do with the moon's application
Hmm.
to a planet like within orb, which happens less frequently than the quote unquote like modern definition, where if the moon is at the end of a sign, and not applying to something within the sign, it's void. So the quote unquote medieval void moon doesn't happen as frequently as the modern void moon, but happens more frequently than, say, like the Hellenistic void moon. So I tend to I know that the moon is void if it's void, and I will just wait a little bit to pull a chart. Or for example, Benatti says that when the moon is in Taurus or in Cancer or in a sign of Jupiter, the void is mitigated. And
Yeah.
so like I did a horary over the weekend when the moon was a bit void in Taurus, and I was just like, it's okay because she's in Taurus and she's having a good time there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So what does the sign of Taurus mean to you, and how do considerations of myth play into your understanding of both the moon and the sign of Taurus?
So I sometimes refer to Taurus as the Garden of Eden sign, because if you think about the progression of the story of the zodiac, I feel like Taurus is when everyone's sort of just chilling, eating their grape fronds, just bathing in like the abundance of nature before, curiosity killed the cat. That's Gemini eating from the tree of knowledge and sort of, getting expelled from the land of plenty. So, Taurus is sort of like this stable, serene, temperate oasis where things are sort of predictable and calm enough for vegetables to grow, for plants to thrive, for there to be an abundant harvest. And so I guess that's how I think of like, the sign of fixed earth. Is that, Aries is just about the seeding, the sprouting, things sort of bursting through into newness. But after you have after an egg is fertilized, then it needs to implant into the womb and receive the nourishment in order to grow. And so that's how I think of Taurus. It's the garden before the trouble of Gemini. And so some things that I associate with Taurus are stillness, resistance to urgency. People say that Taurus is slow and stubborn, but why is everyone else in such a rush?
Yeah.
So, also this idea of moving at the speed of trust or enjoyment. So it's not so much that like in Taurus you're digging in your heels just to cause an issue. It's just that like, I haven't had the time to warm up to yet, or trust isn't something that's built overnight.
Right.
And it makes me think about how like if you're on a date with someone, right, and you're having this amazing chemistry, and sometimes you're kind of operating in a more like that's a little bit more mercurial, right, like the kind of the banter and just the sort of the excitement. But then Taurus is moving at the speed of trust, and so there's this idea of like your body knows when it's ready.
Yeah.
And also moving at the speed of enjoyment. So slowing down, stopping to smell the roses, savoring the coffee. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's also the element of Taurus that people associate with being a little bit bougie. And I certainly think that can be true when you're filtering those qualities through this, the lens of consumerism, right? Because we do live in a consumeristic culture. And so Taurus can certainly look like that in some circumstances, but I do think that it's more consistently across the board, just this ability to sort of ascertain the quality of something. And so, I know like someone who had Venus and Taurus in his 10th house, and part of his job was to go around and sort of like just touch fabrics and be like, oh, this is like a really nice material, right? we can use this in the interior design. I've lived with Taurus roommates before, and one thing I'll never forget is like I was moving out and like we were trying to decide like who kept which silverware, and like he was just like, I like the way this feels in my hand. I'm like, I don't give a shit. Like you can keep whatever you want. So, it's this idea of like, being able to really tell like, oh, this dress was made really well, and this one was just kind of for fast fashion. Being able to, I guess access the paradise within, because I think the original luxury was the luxury of belonging to nature. And so, again, kind of going back to that Garden of Eden image.
Yeah, the Garden of Eden image kind of reminds me of when you're in a state of pleasure that is like you haven't really gotten bored with it yet, or it doesn't feel indulgent to you or what have you, or you're just like, oh, I feel so good, why would I ever do
Yeah,
anything else? Like that kind of feeling.
exactly. Yeah, Gemini comes around because you do eventually get bored.
Hmm. Yeah, and you're like, I need some kind of mutability, I need some kind of change, I need like
Hmm.
yeah, that kind of change there. And I think it's interesting what you said about dating, and like what came to mind with Gemini was like chemistry. And I think
Hmm.
that comes in with like the idea of Gemini as like the bee that's pollinating.
Yeah.
Uh, but that is very different than the trust that I think you brought up with Taurus, where it's like you need chemistry for things to move forward, but it takes a long time to tell whether you can trust a person.
Hmm. Yeah, which maybe there's something to the fact that Taurus and Scorpio are opposite signs.
Mm, yeah. Say a little, do you mind saying a little more about that?
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that because stereotypically we would think of Scorpio as being like the least trusting
Mm-hmm.
sign of all of them,
Mm-hmm.
like the most sort of suspicious of other people's motives. But then you have sort of Taurus, the other side of that, um, which, it's not necessarily that they're looking for ulterior motives. It's just that they might, be more inclined to honor the pace at which those things typically unfold.
Mm. Yeah, I think that the images that come to mind for me thinking about Scorpio and Taurus, I've taken a few of Diana Rose Harper's courses, and she talks about like the different kinds of elements that go with the modalities. And the one that comes to mind with Scorpio is the well, fixed
Mm.
water. And so it's like you don't want to give someone access to the well that you don't trust, because the well, they could do something bad to the water in the well. And if the well gets poisoned, it takes a long time for it to filter through
Oh, yeah.
the soil,
Yeah.
what have you, and like become potable again.
Hmm.
Whereas I think with Taurus, I think of like really just like the bull, and like the solidity of a bull or a cow on the pasture, and just like it's more of like I'm not going to move if I don't want to,
Hmm.
kind of
Yeah.
vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you think some of like people talk about exaltation as like an excess, and the moon is exalted in Taurus, and do you think some of like the bouginess of Taurus comes from like the moon's exaltation there, and the association of the moon with like nourishment and kind of like physical pleasures?
Yeah, I mean, the Taurus moon is definitely a very indulgent moon, and I think all the time about Ace or Alice Sparkly Cat
Mm-hmm.
wrote something about exalted planets having these really big demands and expectations.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I think they said something like Taurus moons expect to be satisfied by life, and that's something that's always kind of stuck in my craw.
mm,
Um, because it isn't, people, yeah, like, yeah, okay, it is nice having an exalted moon. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I do like it, but it's not always easy. Like sometimes it does feel like there's a bit of a princess and the pea thing going on where like, if I don't have 7 to 8 hours of like perfect uninterrupted sleep every night, I will literally fall apart at the seams.
mm-hmm,
If I need to eat every 3 hours, and if I don't, I get hangry, and so it's not that like other people enjoy, being sleep deprived or enjoy being hungry, but I think some people just kind of like accept it more, or like it doesn't really disrupt their day as much.
mm,
um Whereas it just feels like yeah, the Taurus moon is very demanding. Like it requires a lot, to be happy.
mm-hmm.
And then again, it doesn't really require a lot. A simple good meal is enough to feed, to
Yeah.
feed the appetite.
So
Yeah.
it can be simultaneously a bit complicated, but then also just kind of simple when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I mean, one way that I think of it is that like as a Taurus moon, it's always the right time for a little treat. So I don't have trouble sort of granting myself that. Whereas I think
Hmm.
sometimes I talk to people who have like the moon in Capricorn, and there's like this theme of standing in front of the ice cream freezer and like trying to talk yourself out of like whether you deserve to have ice cream today or not.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, an interesting thing that came up with the Capricorn moon, and I think it's like a good contrast because it's the moon is in detriment, quote unquote, in Capricorn. So it has to kind of operate in a way that maybe it wouldn't prefer to. But it's also still an earth sign
Mhm.
in the way that, Taurus is an earth sign.
Yeah.
Um, but you have the exaltation in Taurus. And so I think both of my Capricorn moon guests really talked about the ability, which having a fire moon in the first, I really kind of admired this or was a little bit jealous about it. The ability to kind of just be like, I'm going to compartmentalize now and I'm going to do what needs to be done in this moment. And like, I'll deal with my feelings later. Like, I don't have to feel my feelings right in this moment.
I
Um,
think that might be a Saturnian moon thing more than an Earth moon. I'm gonna be
yeah,
honest.
well,
I
yeah,
do not
totally.
have that ability.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I was gonna
Yeah.
kind of ask in terms of like, how does the exaltation and like exaltation is like this kind of uplifting. It's
Mhm.
perhaps like there's like with like a planet being held up, there's this kind of like there are these kind of like party connotations, which festive connotations with
Yeah.
exaltation, I think. And so it's like maybe the moon in that place or any planet in exaltation, and I kind of speak with some sympathy because I have Jupiter exalted in the eighth as well. It's like it
Mhm.
demands things that like you'd rather not you'd rather not have to like deal with,
Mm.
I don't know.
That's a really interesting way of putting it because I always thought that, yeah, like I always kind of thought about the fact that, like, yeah, my moon's exalted, but it's in the eighth house opposite Pluto. So it's not exactly like we're just, we're just lounging on a clamshell 24/7 with this moon.
Hmm.
I guess with the eighth house placement and the opposition to Pluto, I'm definitely no stranger to the occasional emotional spiral. Like,
Mm,
I'm a Cancer. I have my moon in Taurus, right? I'm very lunar. So I am very familiar with this idea of just kind of like enjoying the full range of my emotional life and like also
mm,
not necessarily like I'm okay with that, but at the same time like sometimes it does go to like very big extremes. And so I guess having the moon exalted means that I can go to those extremes and still somehow kind of be okay.
mm.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think the way that you put it is really interesting. That it's
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know if I'm correct. It's just a kind of a
I'll have to
thought.
think about that some more.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think there's also something to the fact that it's the ruler of my midheaven. And so I guess I've always had big expectations placed on me for like what I could achieve.
Mm,
Um, since I was a child. Yeah. So there's that element of it as well.
mm. Interesting. Do you feel like that's kind of propelled you, or do you feel like that's been a bit of a challenge to kind of, have people like because I can relate to people being like, oh, you have so much potential,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, I would say it's probably a little bit of both.
Mm.
Um, it's sort of the conundrum of like a former gifted and talented kid, right? Like those,
Yes.
whatever. Yeah.
Hard relate. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is good to have people believe in you, but then it is kind of humbling when you kind of get out into the real world and, there's a lot of really talented and smart people out there.
Hmm.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you end up in cities like, I'm in LA. I grew up in New York City. Spent some time there as an adult as well. And I know that you just moved away from New York City, but it's just like, wow, everybody here is really smart,
Mhm.
very generally very attractive, a lot of charismatic people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, is there anything else you want to comment about in terms of the placement of your moon in the eighth house, or do you feel like we covered it?
Um, well, let's see. I mean, there are some kind of like very stereotypical Taurus moon things that I definitely relate to. Like massage is one of my favorite love languages.
Mm.
You got to know that about me almost right away. I also really enjoy cooking and food, to the point where it's like, I guess that's been sort of a theme on this podcast where people talk about like, do they enjoy or not enjoy cooking?
Mm,
Um, and I will say that I don't enjoy cooking if I don't have time to cook. And so
mm,
that was actually one of the things that I had to do last year. And that was even before I got sick, but I was just feeling so burnt out by like the constant, hamster wheel of chores that I just like kind of caved and got a food subscription and like took that off my hands. But when I have the time, when I have ample space to do so, like there's nothing more enjoyable to me than spending 5 or 6 hours preparing an elaborate meal.
mm,
Like that was actually in my last 12th house year when I was like, also living at home briefly for 6 months. I was unemployed and I had nothing to do. And I was, like, how do I fill my time when I'm not applying jobs? So I would plan like this elaborate 3-course meal, like go get the ingredients and just spend all day making it. And that to me was like a really, really fun and satisfying way to spend my time, where like I know
Mm,
that not everyone would say that
yeah.
they like doing that. And so I would just find like the most complicated things I could possibly make. Like I tried to make mole from scratch. Um,
Nice.
yeah, like I made like my dad a Father's Day cake with this hazelnut brittle, and like,
Ooh.
I made my cousin a cake with like this lilac frosting, and just yeah, like I think that's part of the moon being ruled by Venus and Gemini for me.
Hmm.
That yes, I really like food, I enjoy cooking, but for me it's like interesting ingredients and interesting combinations are really stimulating to me. So if
Mm.
I'm out at a restaurant, like I won't pick the same thing over and over again. I usually want to try something new. And I usually will pick the thing that has like an interesting pairing or combination of flavors that I wasn't really expecting.
That's super cool. That's really, really interesting. Yeah, I mean, you talked about like your Venus placement in Gemini in the ninth, and it's interesting because Venus also, in addition to ruling your moon, rules your ascendant, and so there is like a lot of Venusian elements that come in addition to these kind of lunar elements that we talked about with the exalted moon and the midheaven and your sun in Cancer. So I was wondering if there's additional ways that Venus and Gemini like comes into uh, your experience of your moon or just your experience of your chart in general.
Yeah, I mean Venus is doing a lot, as you kind of pointed out.
Mm.
It's the ruler of my ascendant. It's stationing. So I was born 2 days after Venus station direct. It's square my nodes.
Oh, cool.
It's just kind of demanding. It's very demanding and it's very loud.
Mm.
And I mean, I guess, without answering that question directly, there was something I was writing this reflection because I was sort of tracking by progression, like when my Venus would clear the post retrograde shadow. And, I wrote this sort of reflection on how I imagined Venus in my chart. So I wrote that I picture her standing conspicuous and alone in the middle of a clearing, gathering momentum imperceptibly,
Mm.
sheltering the intention to embody a state of grace in her feral wanton form.
Mm. Wow, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
That's really interesting. I feel like I relate a lot to that experience of Venus that you just articulated. And interestingly, I have Venus in Aquarius in like her own decan, but
Hmm.
I was born probably like 5 days before she stationed retrograde. So I have a similarly like slow
Yeah.
Venus, but kind of moving the other way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I think about Venus in Aquarius, especially in that decan, a lot as like, yeah, like on retreat or something. Like she's solitary, and
Yeah.
so it's interesting to hear you kind of echo that with your own Venus placement.
Yeah. And also just kind of like raw and unformed in some ways. Like I've always felt like a little bit of a late bloomer in certain regards.
Mm,
Like it just takes me a while to catch up for some reason, but I guess maybe the wait is worth it.
mm, interesting. And do you attribute that at all to like Venus and Mercury's cadency in the ninth, or is it just kind of the slowness with the station?
Probably more the slowness. And also, being morning star Venus.
Mm.
Goblin mode Venus, I guess. I don't know.
Can you say more about what you mean by Goblin Node Venus with the Morning Star?
Yeah, well, I think of the morning star as just being kind of like more active and warlike. And so
Yeah.
I guess maybe like part of my Venus struggle, as a cis woman too, is that like it took me a while to really kind of feel comfortable with my own femininity, because
Mm,
I feel like a lot of my tendencies were not what was sort of expected of me, like this idea that like women were supposed to be coy and demure, and they wait around for a man to approach them. Whereas like from like day one, if I liked someone, I would just like go after him and tell him, and so
mhm,
like I didn't want to have to be pursued. Like I wanted to do the pursuing.
mm. Yeah, that does feel very Morning Star Venus in a way. Yeah, I'm thinking about like I forget like the names that Morning Star Venus gets or the stories that are associated with it, but yeah, maybe it's like the story of Inanna, she descends into the underworld, and then the morning star is maybe like the ascent from there, like
Mhm.
ascent victorious, but like having had to deal with so much challenging things and like just full of like
Right,
ready
it's a
to
little bit
go.
of like the it's like a little bit of like the post breakup, like, people posting excessive thirst traps online because they just got out of like a bad relationship and they're like ready to like go free again.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
You talked a little bit about the moon Pluto opposition. It's really interesting that the other Taurus moon I had also had a moon Pluto opposition in her chart as well.
Mhm.
But are there any other aspects that come to mind that are important for you to discuss in relation to your moon?
I mean, it does form a loose trine to Neptune as well,
Mm,
which I feel like probably helps contribute to me being intuitive. So the psychic thing, that's not something that I've ever really fully developed enough, but weirdly enough, and I don't know if this is something that like every psychic tells everyone, but I keep having people tell me, if I'm in a doing some sort of intuitive reading, they're like, "Oh, you have vision, you can
mm.
see." And I recognize the seed of that potential in me, but that's not something that I've really kind of tamed or refined.
Yeah, that we talked about psychicness a little bit on the other Taurus moon episode as well. So it's interesting that that's kind
Yeah.
of coming up.
I also feel like there's this pattern in my life where like, either I have like deep infatuations with people or like a lot of my relationships end up seeming kind of peaceful on the surface, but then when they end, it's just like the most turbulent, dramatic thing ever that you couldn't even see coming. And
Mm,
so like that's been sort of something that I've sort of reflected on, like why do I keep getting pulled into these uh situations that seem kind of chill and normal, but then beneath the surface there's this like, I don't know, I feel like I've had at least two of my like longest relationships have involved this sense of the other person kind of communicating or implying that they wouldn't be able to like live without me, you know?
mm,
Just really intense and just kind of like, oh my
very
God, like
intense.
don't say that.
Yeah.
I feel like if there's anything in my chart that might point to that, it would be the Moon Pluto thing.
Mm. Yeah, I'm reminded of Austin Coppock talking about Pluto on a recent astrology podcast episode as like not even like a planet, but like a hellmouth almost, like from Buffy. And like just like a place where things can come out of seemingly from nowhere. And I feel like that is kind of evident with what you're saying of like on the surface or consciously, the relationships feel placid, they feel a certain way, and then kind of out of
Yeah.
nowhere, things come up.
Yeah. And then they just go down in flames.
How have you, I mean, if you found a way to navigate that, like what's some ways that you've learned to navigate that in your life?
I don't know that I really have. I think I'm just kind of more
Mm,
aware of certain red flags now, as an older person.
yeah.
So certainly, in my younger years, if I had known about things like love bombing and gaslighting, it probably would have helped, but
Hmm.
now I do.
Yeah. So you've kind of live and learn a little bit in reference to those things.
Yeah, and I don't know that I'm 100% sure that I'll ever completely, that I'll never be in a situation like that again.
Hmm.
Um, because sometimes it just takes a different form.
Yeah, I feel like there's something to that with just like in my own experience, I have a Moon Mars conjunction in my first house. And I like dealing with anger can be a real challenge. And I found that over time, like living out that aspect, it's not that like I'm perfect and I don't experience that anymore. But I've definitely like learned different ways to cope with that. But it is
Mm.
still something that's just operative and that
Yeah.
I have to navigate.
Yeah. Well, I think, the first step to changing any pattern is always going to just be awareness. So
Mhm.
once you just are able to observe it, then the awareness changes the
Yeah.
the situation, the phenomenon.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that you talk about that because I do think, not to go off on like a total tangent, but you mentioned theurgy, and I just love this thinking about theurgy in relation to this kind of awareness that you brought up. Um, because there can be this argument in astrology over like fate and free will, what's fated and what's free will. And like of the opinion that just by being aware of things or by developing relationships with planets or what have you, like we can change our orientation and therefore change our life or our fate, maybe even.
Mhm.
And so I really appreciate that you brought that up.
Yeah.
Awesome. Have you tracked the cycles of the moon in relation to your own emotional life? And if so, what have you found?
Yeah, in general, I would say Scorpio moons are usually pretty rough for me. Like that's like
Mm,
usually my time of the month, I guess you could say.
okay.
I don't know if it's a combination of like, yeah, traditional, like the essential dignity, like the moon is in fall, but it's also my lunar opposition. Um, so I don't know how much of that is like, yeah, Scorpio moons are rough for everyone by transit, or, maybe especially for me because my moon is exalted. So again, my moon has big expectations of being satisfied. And so, yeah, Scorpio moons, they're either really rough or they're for shopping because that's my second house.
Nice.
Maybe those two things are kind of combined.
Hmm.
Usually during the Libra moon, when it's in my first house, I notice that like I'll be getting like body work done or I'll be getting like a facial. Like there's something with like my physical body,
Right.
kind of, like Libra things, like getting more aligned, going to like a osteopath or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, I would say even though my moon is in the eighth house, I usually enjoy my lunar returns more than Cancer moons for some
Mm,
reason. I don't know that I necessarily have a bad time when the moon's in my eighth house. Except, especially now that Saturn's no longer squaring
hmm.
Taurus.
Yeah.
Um, one of my favorite sort of like, yeah, besides like Taurus moon, Cancer moon, like obviously those are nice, but I also really love transiting Aries moons. I get really energized by them.
Mm,
Um, so that's one of my favorite times of the month to just get a lot done.
nice.
Um, and you know, looking at things by the progressed chart, I would say definitely when my progressed moon was in Scorpio and Capricorn, those were some of the roughest years for me emotionally.
Mm,
So that kind of falls in line with what you'd expect from essential dignity theory.
yeah. Really interesting. I've what you said about the Scorpio moon with your natal moon in Taurus. I've noticed for myself, and it's something I'm going to have to track, I think, a little bit more as time goes on. But the Gemini moon that we were just having with my natal moon in Sag, I think maybe it's because the Saturn has moved into Pisces and is now squaring Gemini,
Yeah.
like overstimulation like crazy, just
Mm,
so overstimulated, which feels
mm,
very kind of apropos moon and Gemini, you know.
mm-hmm,
So yeah, I'm gonna have to kind of track that as time goes on. But yeah, I've noticed for me, interestingly, when the moon is in Scorpio, I'm just like, yeah, I've talked about this before. I'm generally like a pretty emotional person, I think, with the moon in the first, but I'm just like, I see a recess of emotions when the moon's in Scorpio, which is kind of interesting. And then when the moon is in Taurus, I'm just like tired. It's just like
mm.
nap time
Yeah.
for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Take a break.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So what suggestions would you have for someone who's new to astrology or to planetary relationship in forming or initiating a relationship with the moon?
Yeah, I mean, I would say because, the sun and the moon are these two big obvious objects in the sky, you can literally start by just observing it with your naked eye, like moonbathe, hang
Mm,
out under the moon, treat the moonlight as a confessional. So like, the
mm,
moon, tell the moon your secrets, listen to what it says in response. I think that for anyone who's getting into astrology for the first time, tracking moon transits is probably the best way to start teaching yourself astrology, period, because the moon makes a complete revolution every 28 days. It's really easy to kind of notice the minutia and see the same cycles repeating over and over again.
mm,
So before you kind of crowd the kitchen with like everything else, just start with that really.
mm,
um, Kind of get a sense for the basic rhythms. And then of course, the moon cycle is something that like a lot of people when they learn aspect theory, they kind of overlay this idea of like sextiles and squares and oppositions onto like the waxing crescent and the first quarter
mm.
square. Like all of those cycles are kind of similar in that way.
Okay.
Um, so it's a good foundation to start from.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. Anything else you want to add, or do you have any imparting thoughts about the moon?
Yeah, where else can we go with this? Yeah, I mean, I guess when I'm thinking about like Taurus Moon in the eighth house, there's like another aspect of it, which is that I feel like I've always been very blessed with support from other people.
Mm,
And that's one of those things where like, every once in a while someone on Ask or Twitter or something will say like, what's something that comes really easily to you and like what's the placement in your chart? And I guess that's one of those things that like could be easy to take for granted.
yeah.
I guess that's one of the gifts that I would say that that placement has provided.
Hmm.
There's also something, I think my mom and our moons are roughly conjunct. I actually don't know her birth time. I don't know if she's a 0 Taurus moon or 29 Aries moon.
Hmm.
But one of the ways that she bonds with me is by taking me shopping.
Nice.
And there can be this thing where sometimes it's like, I don't need you to do that. I kind of just want you to listen to me emotionally. But it's just interesting how, yeah, there's this almost kind of like over focus on having the material needs met, which can sometimes sort of downgrade the importance of other things.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I also
Yeah.
want to say, it's obviously very different. I have my ascendant ruler in the eighth, but I definitely relate to like eighth house, having eighth house placements and like getting support from other people, and
Hmm.
would definitely be interested to hear if other folks with like prominent eighth house placements have a similar kind of experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then there's also, I mean, the moon is my midheaven ruler. And so there's
Hmm.
also this other aspect of like me playing the role of emotional caretaker or the support system to the public.
Mm,
I guess that's sort of the aspect of my work where I am kind of a counselor,
yeah.
in a way.
Do you feel like as an astrologer, you kind of resonate with that role of astrologer counselor?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I do think I tend to get really into like the data of it, the Gemini of it, but then,
Hmm.
ultimately it's like I'm holding space for the public in a way. Like I'm being like a public cancer, the 10th
Hmm.
house.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see how multifaceted people can be, like there's something about these conversations that I really just enjoy learning about people and, how their charts come to life. And,
Mhm.
I say that just thinking about my own chart, and it's like I have like moon in the first. I feel like I can have a similar, or at least people have told me like throughout my most of my life, like I have a similar kind of like lunar kind of counseling quality when I talk to people, kind of like a support role in that way. But then I
Yeah.
also have Mercury like conjunct my lot of fortune in Capricorn, and I'm very like my thinking is very like
Methodical.
yeah,
Yeah.
methodical and categorized. And it's even funny, I'm reminded of like to mention Erin again, the first episode we had when we were planning for that, before I was like, okay, let's go through all the questions, and she has Mercury and Pisces, and she's like, can we just like go
Can
can
we
we just
just
like
vibe?
go with the flow? And it's like, okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I will say is that working with the progressed lunar cycle has actually become a really foundational way of approaching client work for me. And
Mm,
I will credit Thea Wershing for that. She goes by the Pluto Babe online, but
okay.
I joined her progressed lunar cycle intensive in the fall of 2021. And so she basically has this like 8-week container where like a small group of people will get together and each week we share stories about our lives during like the same progressed lunar phase. So, we all talk about like what happened during our new moon, our waxing crescent, the balsamic phase.
Hmm.
And it was such a neat way of just kind of going through my entire autobiography and really kind of appreciating all the different people I've been. And so I think
Mm.
the progressive lunar cycle really is that bitch. Like it's one of the things that like, I always root all of my transit delineations in. Like I always take that into consideration. And funnily enough, like when I tell clients what phase of life they happen to be in, it tends to be the thing that like resonates with people the most, where they're immediately like, oh yeah, I feel that. I absolutely feel
Hmm.
that 100%.
Yeah.
Um, like almost routinely without fail, if I kind of tell someone, these were the years when you were in your last quarter and your balsamic phase, and were these like some of the most challenging years of your life, people will be like, yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Hmm.
So I liked that experience a lot, and I like working with the progressed lunar cycle a lot because, I don't know, like the moon is constantly changing. It has all these different outfits and costumes it puts on. Like
Hmm.
it's almost like a host at an awards ceremony where they come out with the different costume changes between sets, and you're just like, ah,
Ooh.
Look at her. She changed again.
I like that.
So, I highly recommend doing that for everyone, just kind of sitting with like the details of your life, like going through old diaries and just um sort of appreciate all the people that you've been,
Mm.
all the faces that you've shown to the world.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about my own progressed lunar cycle on the intro episode of this podcast. But basically, a month before I went to Norwalk and like started studying astrology really intensely, I had a progressed new moon, which was also like an eclipse.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah,
Wow. Wow.
so the months before that, I was in grad school for that year, and it was like, especially the semester leading up to that progressed new moon were like really, really tough.
Wow.
Yeah, and now I'm like about to enter the progressed crescent like later this summer, so I'm really interested to see what seeds sprout, like what kind of
Hmm.
shows itself as things that have come into fruition.
Yeah. Where did the new moon eclipse take place for you?
It was in Aquarius.
So that was your third house?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And it's so
Fascinating.
interesting
Yeah.
because I was going to grad school for urban planning,
Mhm.
which I think is a very like third house activity.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about like the third house and the ninth house in terms of like different kinds of laws recently. And
Hmm.
I think like the practice of urban planning is maybe support for the idea of the third house also having some attribution to laws, because the
Hmm.
way that local,
Local ordinances and stuff like
yeah,
that. Yeah.
has
Hmm.
an incredible effect on like the way people's lives happen at that local level.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm about exactly a year away from my new moon at
Mm,
this moment. I'm
okay,
feeling it pretty hard.
yeah, so you're like solidly in that balsamic phase.
Hmm.
Yeah. And so, yeah, how would you describe that to people? And I know that I don't think we touched on actually the lunar or the natal phase, but do you see resonances between the progressed balsamic and like your kind of natal balsamic phase?
Yeah. I mean, technically, I think I'm a last quarter phase,
Mm,
technically, but it's a little bit like almost balsamic.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's
So,
like 75 degrees or something like that, 73 degrees.
mhm. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would characterize being, a natal last quarter phase as having an experience of just sort of internal revolt,
Mm,
just like a sort of internal rebellion against things. And something that actually Thea said about last quarter moons is that a lot of us like lead double lives. And so like there's this idea of like me being an astrologer and me being like a writer to the public and like yeah. I think the aspect of, being in the moon phase where I've kind of like, I'm sort of distilling my experiences and trying to sort of create the seed that I can sort of leave behind and share with other people. I definitely relate to that.
mhm,
With the progressed balsamic, I really feel it really intensely, just in the sense that well, I spent most of my balsamic moon phase isolated, living alone during COVID.
mm,
So that felt like a very just kind of obviously like the world was kind of retreating and shutting down and everyone was having a little bit of that experience, but at the same time we all had very different pandemics.
mhm.
Some people got married, some people had children, some people like really had their lives take off. And
Yeah.
I feel like I've just been kind of hanging out in this limbo space where I was just sort of like, um, well, first of all, I was approaching a crossroads in my career for some time where I knew that eventually, like, I didn't want to be working a full-time job and doing astrology at the same time, and I didn't know what I was going to really do, and I was just kind of coasting and
Mm,
just waiting until the decision felt clear. And then COVID hit, and I was living alone at the time. I wasn't in a relationship, and so I was just kind of like in my deep, deep hermitage,
yeah.
you know. Um,
Mhm,
watching other people sort of have big life things happen to them, and I'm just kind of like I don't know, just I guess sort of in survival mode and just sort of waiting to figure out like what needed to happen.
mhm,
And then around this time last year, I sort of started to like the wheels really started cranking for me.
mm,
I started thinking about, living in other countries and maybe doing this kind of work remotely and, definitely quitting my full-time job. And then I got sick. I got long COVID, which
mm,
I think is very typical of the moon being very low in light is that you literally have less physical vitality. And so
mm,
your body is more susceptible to those kinds of things. And so, fast forward to now, I literally just left New York City after 11 years, the city that I moved to during my full moon phase. I kind of dissolved my entire life there in a way. Like it was just very much like, okay, I don't need any of this anymore. So sometimes when I'm counseling clients who are going through this, I say that the balsamic phase is kind of like the fuck it phase. It's you've already kind of witnessed the turmoil in your own mind and like maybe seen things in your life actively crumble. And now all that's left to do is to more fully detach from that previous cycle of experience and just be willing to drift until you're a seed that can plant itself again somewhere new. And eventually, once I gather my bones, I do want to be sort of living a nomadic lifestyle for a little bit. I don't want to be tethered anywhere. And so I feel like that's gonna sort of potentiate and open up new possibilities that I can't conceive of at the moment. And I'm okay with not really knowing where it goes after that.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you just reminded me a little bit of one of my favorite movies, at least when I was growing up as a kid, which was Forrest Gump, and like the closing scene where the bookmark feather is like floating on the breeze, and he's kind of talking about fate and free will and like this idea of whether things are supposed to happen or if we make them happen. Yeah. And how like they talk about it's like a little bit of both. And so I think that there's something really valuable about allowing yourself to be caught by the breeze and be carried, and to trust that the next cycle that's coming will land you in the place that you're supposed to be.
Yeah, well, if life is like a box of chocolates, then I guess it's all delicious, right? For Moon and Taurus.
Very true. Very true. You never know what you're going to get, but it's
probably going to be good though.
It's probably going to be good. Unless it's like, I don't know, what's like the flavor? Unless it's like, I don't know, coconut or something. I don't know. I don't really like coconut.
Oh, don't slander coconut.
I'm sorry to all the coconut stands out there. I take it back. I apologize. Awesome, Steph. It's been wonderful talking with you today. Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I'm online as Lady Kazimi. That's Lady Kazimi. That's my website. That's my Instagram handle. That's my Twitter handle. I'm open for consults, so hit me up.
Awesome. Anything else that you're working on that you want to let us know about?
Nothing that I'm ready to sort of, reveal to the public just yet.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait for the progressed new moon cycle to bring things forward. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for talking with me today. It's really been a pleasure. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.